I want to be honest about where my head's been at over the last week. I wanted to give up this week. On, I think Wednesday morning, I wrote a list of all the names of the people who have walked away from Jesus since we started GCC. And then I was questioning whether or not God really was powerful to change. And then I wrote down at the bottom of a bunch of questions that we discussed as elders on Monday, when is it the right time to leave? Loads of voices in my head, and as you'll sympathise with, particularly when you go to bed. So feeling this, and then feeling very guilty about feeling like I wanted to leave. So suddenly felt very condemned. How could I feel that way? Start to feel very inadequate and start to lack any sense of confidence. And again, all that in your head, particularly when you are lying in bed. And I share that not because I want your sympathy, I really don't, but I share it with you because I know some of you have had way worse weeks than me. But if we are not willing to bring ourselves to church honest, then there is no point in coming to church. If we can't be honest here, there's no hope for us here. And so our task this morning is to take Romans and wrestle with it until we can relate it to real life. And so that's what I want to try and do this morning. If you look at chapter 8, verse 31, you can see that he's trying to capture and collate everything he's said so far and condense it into something that's digestible for us. So he says in verse 31, "What then shall we say in response to these things?" And the next question he asks is, if God is for us, who can be against us? Now, that question, in the mix of the week and the feelings I had, the answer seemed obvious. If God is for us, who can be against us? The answer came back, well, loads of people. Loads of people can be against us. Some of you have had people screaming at you, chasing you through the streets of Gracemount. Who's against me? Seems like loads of people. And in fact, sometimes the more you try and live for Jesus, it seems like the more people are against you. And you can get a little voice in your head that whispers, God is not for you. If you're in the Bible studies on Tuesday, we were introduced to that. There's a voice of suspicion that arises in your head that within us says, God is not for us. His heart is cold. His hands are tight-fisted. He's got deep pockets with short arms, which means that his portions are stingy. And his mouth normally says no. Maybe you've heard that voice. The voice that says to you, look at everything that you don't have. The voice that says, look at all the people who are having fun because they're saying yes to what God says no to. The voice that says, see, if you look at everything you're going through, how can you imagine that in any way God is for you? Ever had that voice in your head? And so in answer to the question, if God is for us, who can be against us? Sometimes the answer comes back, well, everyone, even God, seemingly. Now the Bible puts a name on that voice. It calls him the deceiver. He deceives us, as believers, into thinking that he is not for us. This is the voice of the deceiver. He says, God is not for you. And Paul, knowing that, asks this question to bring his correction to that deception. Let me tell you a story from the Old Bible to try and illustrate what Paul's trying to do. In the Old Testament part of the Bible, the first part, there's a prophet called Elisha. And one day the prophet Elijah and his wee servant wake up to find out that they are surrounded and trapped by a massive army full of chariots and horses. You can read it in 2 Kings 6. And the wee servant, he panics. He says, "Oh no, my Lord, what shall we do?" But Elisha calmly replies, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Now the wee servant looks at him and Elisha, looks at the massive army, and probably thinks, what's this prophet smoking if this is what he's seeing? But Elisha then prays, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. A spiritual army. See, what he saw just with his eyes was those who are against us are more than those who are with us. But after Elisha prays, he sees with eyes of faith those who are with us are more than those who are against us. And Paul's question in Romans 8 verse 31 is functioning in the same way as Elisha's prayer. Lord, open their eyes so that they might see. This is what Paul wants us to see. When the deceiver says, God is not for you, Paul wants us to see, God is for you, and he has more for you. That's the first thing we're seeing this morning. And we're going to see two things. In each one, there's a kind of, he wants you to see this, but then there's more. So the first one is, God is for you, and he has more for you. Look at verse 32. Listen to this again. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Do you see Paul's logic? He wants you to consider what God has given in the past, so that you are dared to imagine that he will give more in the future. Do you see that? And so he first looks back. He says, what's been given? And the language he uses is of the idea of what can't be spared. When I hear that language, I think back to when I worked in the centre of town a long time ago. You'd walk along Princess Street or Shannon Place or Rose Street, and you'd hear a voice that goes, in a very Edinburgh accent, "Any spare change, pal?" Remember that voice? Now when you hear that voice, what is the beggar confronting you with? He's asking you to consider, what do you have spare? Do I have any coins to spare that I can give him? Do I have any time to spare that I can speak to him? Do I have any energy spare so that I can get to know him? Do I have a bed spare that I would offer him? But pretty much the beggar doesn't even get what's spare. Paul is trying to show you, God doesn't operate towards you on the basis of what he can spare. He operates towards you on the basis of sparing nothing. He did not spare his only son. But the words are amazing. He gave him up for us all. The words that stood out to me this week were, for us all. He wouldn't spare his only son, but give him up for us all. Next Saturday, Amy's dad, Andy, that's his name, isn't it? Andrew. Will walk Amy down the aisle of a church. He'll walk slowly, because he knows what he's got to do at the bottom of the aisle. Every step he walks further down the aisle, he knows he's getting closer to the moment where he will have to give Amy away. But the hardest, how do you think he's feeling in that moment? The hardest thing for him isn't just that he has to give Amy away. That's hard. But the more remarkable thing is who he has to give her away to. Isn't it? How does he feel? It's like he's walking down the aisle with a precious, priceless Ming vase, knowing at the bottom of the aisle he's got to hand it to a monkey. Isn't it? And that's not just because it's Josh. It would be the same with any man. Why? Because it is his only beloved daughter. The remarkable thing is not just that God would graciously give up his only son, but that he would give him up for us all. Isn't it? For us. He's giving up his son to go to a cross, to suffer, to save us all. Beggars who don't even deserve what is spared. He does not spare his only son. Don't believe the deceiver. He'll come and say, God is not for you. God has demonstrated how much he is for you at the cross. I look back, I see what he's done, and the cross says, how much is God for you? The cross says, this much. He's for you. He wants you to look back. If you're not a believer here, and this is new to you, maybe you don't even believe there's a God. But I think sometimes we say, well, if there is a God, surely he must be favourably disposed towards me. I'm good enough that he'd want me on his team. Or maybe I've had a hard enough life that he's going to say, oh, come on, I'll take pity on you. The reality is, God ought to be against us. Early in Romans, he calls us enemies. Have you ever considered if there is a God, he might be against you? I'm not just a beggar, I'm an enemy. And that's, for us as Christians, what makes the gift even more amazing. I ought to be an enemy, but he doesn't even spare his son for me. So, that's the first part of the logic. Look back. He is for you. He's demonstrated that in giving up his son for us all. But there's a logic. He's making you look back, demonstrate what's been done in the past, so that you dare to imagine there might be more. Look at verse 32. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? So the logic is, he's for you, and there's more for you. He's for you and there's more for you. The words along, all, and also are beautiful. How will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? God is not a God who gets poorer when he gives. He's got more. And the cross isn't just the proof that he loved you, it's the proof that he loves you. And if he gives the most precious thing for you, how will he not also give all things for you? There's more. Now, I think the all things has a very specific thing here. I think, if you remember last week, all those he foreknew, he predestined. Those he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. Those he justified, he glorified. That's the all things. He is not here promising to give you everything you want so that you can have a life conformed to the pattern of this world. That's not the all things. He is promising to give you everything you need so that you will be conformed to the glory of his Son. And he'll do that amid the groans of this creation to bring an inward transformation in you. But one day he will bring a total transformation to bring you to the perfect glory of his Son in the new creation. And he's saying if he's given his Son for you at the cross, he will graciously give you all things. He's for you, and there's more for you. And so this question that Paul is asking, he wants you to bring it to your questions. I don't know what your questions are at the end of this week. Will the challenges of living in grace might be worth it? Will the sacrifices of singleness for Jesus be worth it? Will the cost of following Jesus be worth it? Will the rattle of coming off a habit be worth it? Will the investment of a retirement be worth it? Will trusting God while living with the consequences of sin be worth it? Paul says, He's for you, and there's more for you. The generosity of the groans in the old rugged cross assure you of His generosity in the glorious renewed creation. He's for you, and there's more for you. That's what I need to hear. So that's our first thing. One thing, but more. For you and more for you. But he asks another question. Look at verse 33. So he says, who will bring any charge against those whom God's chosen? It's God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? And this is a bit I've struggled with. No one. But again, amid the week that I've had, that's not the answer that comes back. In fact, that answer seems absurd. There's loads of things and people and voices that condemn me. Haven't you felt that this week? The condemning charges have come in my little head. How can you think about people like that and be their pastor? How can you think God is for you when your ministry seems to be failing? Your ministry fits better on a charge sheet than a CV. You ever felt condemned this week? How can Paul say, who is the one who condemns? No one! How can he say that? The Bible puts a name on that voice. We said the first one was he's called the deceiver. And he says, God is not for you. But the Bible gives Satan another name. It calls him the accuser. And he accuses God's people to make them believe that God could not and will not justify them. He says, you are condemned. And so why does Paul put it in such a black and white way when it doesn't feel like it's such a black and white thing? He does it to convince my troubled conscience that God justifies me in such a conclusive way that any charges or condemning voices that come against me hold no weight. Let me tell you another story from the Old Testament to help us grasp this. Because he says in verse 34, stating it as fact, verse 34, you are justified because Christ Jesus died. Fact. The other story in the Old Testament is recorded by a guy called Zechariah. And God gives him a vision of a high priest called Joshua. And the high priest Joshua is standing there, and you can read this in Zechariah 3, and we are told Satan was standing at his right side to accuse him. You get the picture? He is Joshua the high priest, but at his right side, right in his ear, is Satan accusing him. But where Satan's accusing Joshua, God starts to rebuke Satan. He silences Satan. He mutes the accuser. And I want you to see the way God chooses to demonstrate it. The way that he assures Joshua amid all of the accusations. Listen to this. It's beautiful. Now, Joshua was dressed in filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. The angel said to those who were standing before him, take off his filthy clothes. And then he said to Joshua, see, I have taken away your sin, and I will put fine garments on you. Then I said, put a clean turban on his head. So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him while the angel of the Lord stood by. you see the picture? Dirty clothes gone, clean clothes gifted. Why? So that the accusations can be silenced and acceptance can be secured. What has happened to someone who has put their faith in Jesus Christ? In the fact that Jesus Christ died. What's happened? He takes and wears your dirty clothes and suffers for them in the cross so that he can gift you his clean clothes and say, take these, wear these. They were mine. They're now yours. Which means the accuser has nothing on me because I have Christ's righteousness on me. Do you get the point? Satan can be at my ear, but he has nothing to accuse me of because I'm wearing Jesus' gear. That's the point. If you're not a Christian, this is the heart of what we believe and the heart of what you need. But that's why Paul says, in such a black and white way, Christ has died for you. He's died. And it's God who justifies, and so no one can condemn. Christ has died for us. Have you got that? But remember, like the first one, he's for you and he's got more for you. He wants to say this time, Christ died for you. And, look at verse 34. It's a great phrase. More than that. Christ died for you, but there's more than that. He's saying, don't just think about the fact that Christ died for you, past tense. You need to think about something that Jesus is doing for you, present tense. And he's saying, he died for us, and he lives for us. Look at it in verse 34. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding, and grab this phrase, for us. He died for us and he lives for us. So a Christian doesn't just say, I believe that God is for me. I believe that Christ died for me. A believer is someone who says, I believe that Christ lives for me. He didn't just die, he rose. He didn't just rise, but he ascended to heaven. And he's not just ascended to the right hand of God to sit. He's ascended to the right hand of God to intercede for you. He lives for us to intercede for us. Now, I don't know if you've ever asked a question, what is Jesus doing right now? Ever wondered that? At 11:37 on this Sunday morning, while we're doing this in Gracemount, what is Jesus doing now? Well, heaven is a party, so he's celebrating. Heaven is pleasure, so he's content. But this is saying heaven is a prayer meeting. Isn't that an amazing thought? That amid the party and pleasure of heaven, Jesus is concerning himself with our problems on earth. He's interceding for you. Now, we probably need to get our idea of a prayer meeting out of our heads. This is not the kind of peaceful prayer meeting that we're used to. This is Jesus engaging in the combat where charges and condemnation are flying. To intercede means to intervene on behalf of someone else. To be the go-between. Now, I'm trying to get my head around this week. I think there is an important sense in which this is Jesus as the go-between between us and God. But God knows we're justified. So what does it mean that he's interceding? I think what's going on here is that amid all the charges and the condemning thoughts that are coming at Christians, Jesus is intervening, interceding, going in between them and us. So imagine, here's me. Crap week. Terrible thoughts in here. A lot of guilt in here. And there's charges flying, trying to come at me saying, like the accuser, you are condemned. What is Christ doing right now in heaven? He is interceding. He is intervening between them and me. So they come at me saying, you are condemned, and Christ comes in between, and what does he say? No one condemns. There is no condemnation for those who are in me. So when these things come at you, and they're trying to put guilt on your conscience, and trying to put dirt on your clean clothes, Jesus places in between his nail-pierced hands, and he says, who is the one who condemns? No one. No one. Now, I'm not usually someone who uses long quotes in my sermons, but I'm going to quote this guy. He's long dead, and he's got a tremendous name, which is one of the reasons I'm going to quote him. His name is Octavius Winslow, and if the Loshers haven't got a name for their baby boy, if it's going to be a boy, Octavius has got to be high up on the list. But I'm going to finish with this. He says, tried, tempted believer, Jesus makes intercession for you. Your case isn't unknown to him. Your sorrow is not hidden from him. Your name is on his heart. Your burden is on his shoulder. And because he not only has prayed for you, but prays for you now, your faith shall not fail. Your great accuser may stand at your right hand to condemn you, but your great advocate, lawyer, stands at the right hand of God to plead for you. And greater is he that is for you than all that are against you. Greater is he that is for you than all that are against you. He is for you, and he's got more for you. He died for you, and he lives